What is going on, YouTube? It is Let's Talk Books 21st Century Lens back with the book of the week, and this week we are going to be discussing The Wager, an incredible nonfiction novel that took place in 18th century Britain. The story actually occurred in South America, but from the perspective of British imperialists. To set the stage of this incredible book, and I say incredible because it's a nonfiction, but it reads like a fiction and like a thriller, and you just can't believe what you're reading. To set the stage, let me give you a quote by the author David Grann. "Empires preserve their power with the stories that they tell, but just as critical are the stories they don't, the dark silences they impose, the pages they tear out." I think that helps set the stage for this book because what happens and what transpires, at least as far as we know, is at some point in the 18th century, this ship, the Wager, crashed on in Patagonia in South America, coming from Britain. And on that island, the naval hierarchy fell apart. So there was a shipwreck. At the time, there was a captain, Captain Cheap, who's one of the perspectives of the book. He wants to maintain order on this island and, believes that he should have the ultimate say, even though they're no longer at sea. There was a mutineering party under the gunner of the ship who was proving himself to be competent, so people were flocking to him, competent on the island, surviving with limited resources. And then the third perspective is a person named Lord Byron, who was 16 at the time and was loyal to Captain Cheap, but was kind of seeing both sides of the story play out. And what happened was, eventually, one of the mutineering party ended up making a decision to travel 3,000 miles to a neutral plot of land in Brazil, whilst the captain decided to travel 300 miles north to enemy territory. A lot transpired. That's not spoiling anything because that's even listed on the back page of the book, that two parties get out of this situation alive, and one of them got back to Britain first, so they got to tell their side of the story. This was the mutineering party. Years later, Captain Cheap shows up and says that what they're saying is not true. And so all these people from the shipwreck who were still alive, the ones that survived, were court-martialed to tell their story. And I won't spoil what happens by way of court-martial and telling their stories, but I will say the bulk of the book is them trying to survive and looking at what happens when what was a stable hierarchy of British command, what happens when they're isolated and put in a survival situation and no longer at sea. Do these hierarchies survive? What leadership traits end up bringing to light followers or bringing followers to them? What happens when people become severely hungry? Some people on the island succumb to cannibalism. So there is so much breaking out, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the clear ties or similarities to Lord of the Flies. It is basically a Lord of the Flies with adults, where all hell breaks loose on this island. So why do I think this book is awesome? There are 3 point of views predominantly throughout the book. Lord Byron, who was the young midshipman on the boat. There was the gunner, who ultimately would become the leader of the mutineering party, and then Captain Cheap. And because it's a historical novel where we only have the journals and the logbooks and the stories and books that were written back then to derive who was telling the truth, the author was in a conundrum. He's like, how can I tell the story from a point of authority if we don't actually know which story was ultimately true? And the genius is that he left it to the reader to decide. So he shows all 3 viewpoints. He lets you decide which story you kind of most align with. And on top of that, you start to think as you're reading through this story, what would I have done if I was in this boat that shipwrecked? Would I have gone to the mutineering party, whose leader may have been more competent, may have been making more sound decisions? Would I have gone to the captain of the naval ship because I was afraid of punishment should we somehow make it off this island alive? The punishment for mutiny at the time was extremely strict, oftentimes death, because these imperialistic, or Britain in particular in the 18th century was imperialistic. The story they were telling to the world was, we know what's best, we know what we're doing, and we are the spectacle of progress. And the people on the ground were, the boots on the ground, were basically the enforcers of this ideology. And so mutineering within that and going against the story of the British Empire was extremely dangerous. So overall, the plot, the structure, the way you're reading it, I love it all. I will say, if you're going into it, you have to make it past 120 pages of setup. That is just the reality of the book. I think the setup was important, but it did kind of drag on. It got kind of boring at times, understanding how these people got onto the ship, what were they doing, what was the overall mission of going to South America, Patagonia, why were they competing with Spain in the War of Jenkins' Ear. All of this backstory, it is important, it's fascinating, but if you're just hoping to get to the Lord of the Flies part, you do have to suffer through a lot of setup. One of the closest comparisons to this book, where if you enjoyed this book, I can guarantee you'll like this book, would be the book Unbroken, which was a tale of survival from World War II, where you just don't see any path to success for getting out of this situation. But ultimately they do. That is similar to The Wager, different outcomes, different story, different war. But if that sort of story entices you, Unbroken that is, I can almost guarantee you will like The Wager. If you want a full breakdown on my thoughts from this book, please consider subscribing to my Substack in the link in the description, where I break down The Wager and the lessons I derived from it, specifically as it pertains to leadership. I thought it was interesting to see what traits were seen as the better leadership traits in complete isolation in a survival situation, and what could cause people to mutineer and choose a new leader under times of duress. And I will read just a snippet from my article to see if it's of interest to you. I am writing regarding the profundity of the decision to choose a mutineering party over the captain of the ship, knowing what the punishment could be for mutiny. The profundity is found in their ability to make that decision, given that people were dropping from hunger and disease by the day. Competency and trust in action go a long way, even if you're not stranded on an island, starving, and dealing with power struggles. From a societal view, order comes from many things, but a big variable is fear of punishment for going out of bounds on societal norms or laws. When you strip that away and place what was once a functioning hierarchy of people on a desolate island, it is interesting to see what happens when survival takes precedence over maintaining order. Do titles become entirely arbitrary? What leads to the emergence of new leaders? Can shooting someone in the face be a compelling enough act to deter being crossed? All of these questions are explored in this story. And that is true. Someone is shot in the face on the island, and it does cause a spark of outrage that leads to a lot of different things. Of note through this book that just filled me with gratitude was, one, it's kind of funny to read a book this dark and depressing where people are dropping from scurvy, from hunger, being worked to the brink of their existence. There's all these power struggles going on. People are being punished on the island. All hell is breaking loose. And I'm sitting here going to bed in my, air-conditioned house under my thick sheets. It really does give you a sense of gratitude, not only for my current circumstances, but man, maybe these people in the 18th century were built different, because it's really hard to picture yourself going through what they went through to come out alive. One more note from my article. I messaged a friend, if I died from scurvy, having endured bleeding, gums, swollen limbs, rotten teeth, wounds reopening, only to later find out that sucking on some limes would have cured my condition, I'm throwing hands. Scurvy was running rampant on these ships. In time, we would discover that it was just a vitamin C deficiency. So it's kind of funny to see how people react to a lack of understanding of things going on before scientific understanding. So, some people were taking random pills, psilocyanide. Some people were just dropping dead. Some people claim this was just what happens when you're out at sea too long because we're land creatures. Some people posited that you'd have to bury your head up in the ground up to your neck to soak in whatever it is on Earth that doesn't cause scurvy. So my point there just being incredibly grateful for living in the 21st century where we have a greater understanding of these diseases, and fascinating to read how people reacted to things before our scientific understanding of them. Along with that were people falling and dying to what we now know as refeeding syndrome. This was first better understood after World War II from witnessing prisoners of war re-eat too fast and then passing away. They were also, the same thing happened on the Wager, where they would land a kill of a sea lion or something like that and eat it and then pass away because they had consumed too many calories, and we now know that this is refeeding syndrome. So this isn't the main point of the story, but just fascinating to see how we reacted to things before we had a scientific understanding of them. So that is the book for the week. That was The Wager by David Grann. Let's talk about would I recommend it. So on a scale of toss it, skim it, read it, or binge it, where would I put it? I'd put it in read it. The only reason I'm docking a point from this book, and there's really nothing against the author, he did a fantastic job of compiling the story, and I do think the precursor was necessary, but those first 120 pages can be a slog. It's worth it if you get to the Lord of the Flies portion of the book. However, that setup can take a while, and I do think it kind of dragged on at times. Ultimately, read the book. You'll learn a lot about yourself. You'll be grateful you live in the 21st century. And thank you so much for being here, and talk to you next week.